Death is the only certainty we have. It's the natural order of things. We are born, we live, and then we die. This is the fate of all mortals. Then perhaps it's fitting that some of the most terrifying monsters are the ones who defy this norm. They are the undead, the ones who opposed and transcended mortality in exchange for the loss of their humanity. For better or worse, there are many interpretations of the undead and what they manifest as, but only one has been featured frequently in fantasy realms to the point that they are their own class or race. Vampires. Now, of course, we'll be separating fact from fiction here, but the question must be asked, if vampires are a race or group, and were real and they coexisted among us throughout history, what would they look like? How would they survive? Would they thrive amongst us, or would they be destroyed? Let's take a look. This is Fantastical History. To kick things off, let's get a few rules down about vampires and understand what they are. The definition of a vampire is obvious. They're an undead monster that sustains itself with human blood. Legends about these creatures are as old as man can think back. Every culture has their own take on the monsters, but why do they need blood to live? We'll discuss those reasons as we progress. There are so many different interpretations of vampires in fantasy and pop culture, I tend to break them down into 4 categories: the demonic, the supernatural, the feral, and the tortured. The former 2 are very similar but with different context behind them, and the latter 2 are also similar but with different outlooks. The demonic vampire is a vampire like Dracula or Alucard from Hellsing, though they're technically the same monster actually. This vampire is unspeakably powerful with near immortality at their command, powers of transformation, teleportation, regeneration, transmutation, necromancy, telekinesis, hypnotism, and other amazing powers that put them clearly above a human. Their weakness is that they are afflicted with more weaknesses: sunlight, crosses, garlic, silver, blessed blades and bullets, the church hymns to God, and other such things. They drink blood because they are evil and unholy. They represent the unlife, and thus must feed on the living to sustain themselves. In fact, it was believed that Dracula was representative of the Antichrist. While Christ gave blood for our salvation, Dracula takes blood for his. A complete opposite. They are the definition of an unholy entity, and thus are heresy made real. And for this reason, they are also very rare. They might be hard to put down, but you're unlikely to meet any in a day-to-day encounter. The supernatural vampire is slightly different. They too have supernatural powers like transformation, necromancy, hypnotism, and other such powers, but they're slightly more limited, more prone to death and fatal blows. Good examples of these might be the vampire lords from Warhammer Fantasy or the vampires of Elder Scrolls. They have more power than the average human, but they are more easily killed if reached and bested in combat. They also have the potential to be far more numerous. They likely drink blood because it's their only known food source. They themselves can no longer exist by the rules of mortals, like eating food, drinking water, requiring sleep. Thus they supplement it with their other necessary component of man: blood. Normally, the supernatural vampires are not unholy as much as they are a race or species. They are pure-blooded beasts who have the potential to turn mortals into their own kin, and thus there can be hierarchies, internal rules and strife, and clear-cut motivations for their groups, clans, or kingdoms. The feral vampire is an apex predator. They lack basic humanity. They rarely talk, are cunning but not intellectual, and either hunt individually or like a pack of wolves. Examples of these can be found in 30 Days of Night or Blade. They don't have many supernatural powers outside of perhaps regeneration and the ability to turn others into vampires, but they can't transform, they can't summon ghouls or zombies, and their power is limited. However, they make up for this by being absolutely ruthless. The reason they drink blood might be explained by a biological component. For this brand of vampire, they might have more of a blood disorder, where their red blood cells don't have the hemoglobin to allow oxygen to attach, and thus they would eventually die. They make up for this by drinking blood with rich oxygen, thus sustaining them for a time. This also has another series of side effects, which we'll get into later, but for now, this would be a more scientific explanation for why vampires require blood to live. These vampires see humans as cattle. They are prey, and whether they are animals like in 30 Days of Night or rational thinking creatures like in Blade, they do not show empathy to mortals. To them, humans only exist to be food, and that is the nature of it. The tortured vampire is probably the more heart-throbbing of the 4. They can possess limited supernatural powers like speed, strength, and stamina, but they are more vulnerable than the demonic or supernatural classes. Vampires like these can be found in Twilight and Cirque du Freak. What sets them apart from others are 2 factors. They maintain some degree of their humanity because they often recognize the difference between them and mortals and tend to regret their change, often extrapolating the curse they are afflicted with and wishing they had never chosen it. The other factor is that they do not see humans as food. Certainly they do feed on humans, that's their nature, but they don't relish it. They feed on humans for the same reason as feral vampires, a lack of hemoglobin in the blood to sustain life. However, the side effects might explain the thirst. If their blood is starved of oxygen, they will begin to crave blood, need it, yearn for it as a means of survival, and then, once they drink the blood, it would be like a drug high. Much like how if Luffy's Gear Second allows him to increase the rate of blood flow through his body to dope his own body on oxygenated blood, so could a vampire dope himself on the blood of his prey, thus literally getting high on their own food, making the craving even stronger and making it seem more like a drug addiction, adding more sympathy to their condition.
つまりドーピングのようなものか。足をポンプにして血の流れを加速させている。常人の体ならば心臓が張り裂けるほどの血圧にも内臓も血管も全てがゴムならば耐えられるゴム人間ならではの技だ。
They would hate their need and their desire, their thirst. They would treat it like an addiction and want help, or perhaps there would be some who don't mind it and just want their own personal high. Those that don't like it will often find alternatives or ways to avoid this inevitability. Now, you might find elements of these four mingled in with each other, like how in Twilight some vampires like Edward are the tortured vampire, but then they have that weird vampire government that they have, which is more like a supernatural class. Then in Hellsing, Alucard is certainly the demonic, but they have plenty of lesser vampires who are supernatural or feral. So, which one are we looking at? Well, I'd hate to neglect any, so let's take a brief look at all of them. We'll be analyzing how they'd exist, how humanity would treat them, and if they would make it into the modern era. The demonic vampire like Dracula would be a bit of a rough sell, especially in the Middle Ages when the church was very swift to put down demonic or satanic practices. The idea of a demonic monster or entity like Dracula would be an immediate problem, and the church would gain a lot of power and support once that was made known. While we can look at a character like Alucard and see him mowing down a field of enemy warriors without much problem, Dracula himself was smart enough to know it's better to be discreet. Which brings us to their cunning and intelligence. Even still, the threat that a demonic and unholy monster would have on the people would prove too great. As time marched on and people became more wise to the powers and dangers of vampirism, vampire hunting groups would emerge. The Inquisition would arm themselves with holy weapons, and since demonic vampires have a wide array of clear-cut weaknesses, eventually they would be killed. I don't see true demonic vampires lasting past the Renaissance or Industrial Age. In warfare, they would be exceptional at night raids or attacks and want to limit their engagement to when the sun is down. With the power to raise the undead or summon animals like bats and wolves, they could produce an army of their own making. However, don't let this fool you. Daylight is their enemy, and unless they have loyal minions willing to guard their fortifications during the day, they would be exposed. Frankly, unless they're Alucard, a demonic vampire is of limited use in battle or war. But while we're on that topic, Alucard himself is a one-man army. The idea of a monster like that actually existing is a terrifying prospect. He changed the very definition of the battlefield from a field of war to a literal massacre. I hesitate to even analyze how a fight like that would play out. The supernatural vampire is a different matter entirely, for the sole reason that they are not as rare as demonic. They can organize, socialize, and work together as a collective. Though they have fewer obvious weaknesses, they are more killable and more mortal. To put it simply, if you cut off Alucard's head, well...
Oh, well, that's step 1. What about 2 through 10?
Ah, Christ!
But if you cut off Lord Harkon's head, he's probably gonna stay dead. To compensate, the vampires organize as a clan, unit, kingdom, or group. This means that they might have their own military. Now, there will probably be hierarchies. In Skyrim, there are pure-blood vampires, and there are blooded vampires. The pure-blood vampires are from a direct line. They were born vampires because their parents were vampires. But a blooded vampire is someone who was mortal who became a vampire. The pure-blood would probably have more clout and power than the blooded. But even the blooded would have more position and power than the ghouls or undead that serve them. The best battlefield tactic these supernatural monsters could use is their ability to raise the undead to fight their battles, as the Warhammer Fantasy vampires do, assuming that's a power they have. If they have the power to kill an enemy and then reanimate them as a ghoul or zombie to fight for them, you have a near limitless pool of loyal, unwavering warriors. As your enemies' numbers dwindle, your own numbers will increase, meaning that the vampire armies have nothing to fear from getting in close and personal. They would relish an up-close fight and would use that to their advantage. The vampire would also likely favor bladed weapons like swords and glaives in order to draw blood and feed their power and strength. Like demonic vampires, they would be limited to battling at night, but if they can raise undead legions, it's possible that the undead might not share the same weakness. They might be able to battle on, even while the vampires retreat to their shelter. Frankly, fighting supernatural vampire clans or groups would be incredibly risky and dangerous, even for an elite army. But it's not like it can't be done. Napoleon said it best: God favors the army with the best artillery. The Mongolians perfected the art of horse archery, and fire has been a tool to the Chinese, the Romans, and the Greeks since ancient times. The key is distance. The vampire needs to get in close, and if we assume their zombies are not dexterous enough to use archery or ranged weapons, then this gives mortals a distinct advantage as long as they can keep their distance and rain fire or artillery down on the undead. Even if the undead have the dexterity to fire ranged weapons, we also have to assume those drones lack intelligence, and thus will not always aim for critical points to take advantage of. Fast-moving horse archers or well-armed field artillery will be a huge problem for the vampiric forces. Plus, there's also going to be an issue of resources for the vampires. Certainly, having undead minions who don't need food, shelter, or water is beneficial, but the vampires themselves are not so lucky. They not only need food, they need a specific food source: human blood. What happens if the human kingdoms figure this out and literally starve out this inhuman filth? Have the citizens flee from the countryside and take shelter in castles and city walls. Without food, the vampires will get desperate. They'd make reckless choices, spread their forces thin, and might, just might, need to negotiate. Which will come into the biggest issue the vampires face: diplomacy. As Winston Churchill famously said, you cannot negotiate with a tiger when your head is already in its mouth. My response to that is this: why would I negotiate with a being who sees me as its food? I'm going to evade it or kill it. The vampires might act superior, but even they still struggle to maintain territory when they rely only on the undead to tend their fields and land, and thus they will need to work with humans at some point, and few will want to negotiate with them. Few will have that desire. They could try infiltration and converting or turning a population against itself over time, but that's assuming the humans aren't on the lookout for them in the first place, and given the superstitious nature of the medieval world, that's not likely. They would need thralls or human slaves in order to work for them, and that alone will be difficult to maintain because they too need food, care, and control. They will fear the repercussions of putting their head in the tiger's jaws. Now, all of this in mind, the supernatural vampires will likely last a long time because they have such sway in battle and can maintain strong control of a territory unopposed. At least until the Napoleonic era. When artillery weaponry becomes commonplace, undead legions won't be a real issue, especially if these pompous and superior vampires never trade with humans to gain access to this technology. Even if they could use it, can the undead legion use it? Can vampires use it? Who knows? And even if they could, will the hierarchy of the vampires allow for them to function as a cohesive unit? Or will the blooded underlings reject their pure blood masters? The fact that these vampires form organized units could just be as detrimental as it is helpful. Feral vampires are a question mark because we need to establish how animalistic they are. In 30 Days of Night, they are the equivalent of wild dogs, and that will not serve them well as history progresses. They reject guns and knives in favor of long nails and savage teeth. They have speed and strength on their side, but the sun will destroy them. They may work as a pack or unit, but they are limited to when they can hunt, and since they're so visually inhuman, they will struggle to draw in prey. They would be seen and treated no different than wolves or lions by the ancient world, hunting them down and killing them if they become a threat. And even then, the larger a pack of vampires, the more resources they would need to survive. Even if you had a pack of 45 vampires hiding in the Roman catacombs, it wouldn't take long for the Romans to grow wise to it and start torching the entryways. However, if they're somewhat intelligent, like in Blade or Supernatural, that will be much different. They're not only capable of organizing, but they can pass for human in forms of language, behavior, and appearance, meaning that they can easily lure their prey to their hideouts to feed. There's actually a great scene from Supernatural where a vampire meets a girl at a bar and plays off the Edward Cullen routine of being a tortured soul to woo her into his arms, only to feed on her when she's alone. These creatures still see us as food, even if they say otherwise, and that's the defining characteristic. This would make them very difficult to eliminate. During the age of the Inquisition, they would be hunted with impunity. The vampires would need to go deep underground and feign out of the public eye to survive, if they could. But superstition and general paranoia would make hunting all that much harder. Repopulating would become a priority. Trying to blood or breed as often as possible to keep their numbers at a level they could manage. Of course, this can backfire as well. Younger vampires or newly blooded ones will not be as able to control their thirst for blood and will be reckless, allowing them to more easily be captured. Also, there's no guarantee that a newly blooded vampire won't resent their new state and turn against their captors, turning them over to the human authorities and allowing themselves to die. I could see this very much happening in feudal Japan or in the medieval European nations. To these people, vampires are not another species or race. They are simply a monster or predator that looks for the doorstep. Regardless of how human they appear, they are a threat, and you'd be surprised how easy it is for the ancient world to deem someone a threat, no matter how familiar they look. Ancient cultures had a very easy time branding even fellow humans as enemies and painting them as dangerous. Now give those other humans a taste for human blood, and now the job is much easier. I predict they'd be mostly extinct or driven into obscurity by the late 18th century, if not earlier. The tortured vampires are actually probably the most likely to survive in the modern age. Let me explain. Though they might be vampires and require blood to feed, they haven't lost sight of their basic humanity. Many still seek socialization of some variety, or they seek some degree of normalcy. Most resent their nature and their craving for blood and try to substitute it, avoid it, or do it in small doses. They often lack the myriad of supernatural powers that would make them superior to humanity to the point of being monstrous, and can easily pass themselves off as human enough that they could meld into human society. If their ability to socialize with humans is still there, and their ability to hide or rein in their vampiric nature is possible, then they could easily hide in plain sight. Now, there are, of course, caveats to this. In Twilight, the Volturi are the government that rule over vampires, and from them, we learn that vampires are given supernatural powers like quirks. Some can read minds, some can predict the future, some can torture people with just a glare, some have X-Men level powers, and on and on. They also have skin that is hard as diamond and can only be harmed by another vampire or a werewolf. This begs the question, if they're this powerful, why hide from humanity at all? They could easily have conquered the ancient world. Why? Well, their bodies are strong as diamond, thus meaning no conventional weapon could kill them. They're immune to the sun, so they lack the night and day limitation. They are not weak to garlic, the cross, silver, or holy items, so they have no clear dangers. It's even proven that werewolves, while their natural enemy, are not their equals in all circumstances, just a danger. With the organization and intelligence of humans, the indestructible bodies that could withstand a bullet, the strength and speed of a superhuman, and the addition of X-Men level superpowers, why couldn't vampires rise up and rule the world? Well, that's an obvious outcome to consider. Is it possible that vampires could rule humans and make them cattle? Perhaps, but this is where we have to circle back to the demonic vampire. Alucard in the manga and the TV series, not Ultimate, insults the vampire priest by implying that vampires like him would spread their filth to the point of either destroying humanity or having humanity turn its ire against them, going so far as to proclaim he has no self-respect.
You are a fool who creates slaves to do his dirty work, a coward and an incompetent, incapable of doing anything on your own. You're not worthy of the lowest pits of hell.
Both of us are vampires!
You act more like a cockroach than a proper vampire. Left on your own, you would cover the world in filth. I can't stand your kind. You don't have the self-respect to be a vampire, you undead maggot. You barely know what you are. As for me, I have my own reasons for serving my human master. But that's not a story for trash like you.
Despite how powerful they are, it's reasonable to assume smarter vampires would know their power and the potential they have to send themselves into extinction. Demonic vampires especially would know this, which is why they likely do all they could to remain obscure. It doesn't make sense for the vampires of Twilight though, because frankly they're so goddamn OP, what do they have to fear? If they existed in reality, they have no reason to hide. But it's for this reason I don't see them ever existing in history. However, if we're talking about a vulnerable vampire, a race of vampires who have the hemoglobin deficiency and that's it, that's their only affliction, that actually might be a reasonable one to deal with. Human society would initially see them as monstrous for their need to drink blood, but time would see that view of them change. The anime Interview with Monster Girls handles this well by showing how the government begins to make concessions for vampires, like a monthly blood pack supply to sustain them, giving them lighter clothing to wear since the sun wears them down, and government agencies specifically meant to monitor the behavior and well-being of vampires and other monster girls or demi-humans as they're so called. Of course, there will be some vampires who embrace their more dangerous side and enjoy the idea of relishing in killing, carnage, and bloodlust, but assuming that they were for the few and far between, vampirism itself might be viewed less as dangerous and monstrous, but just another special circumstance. The downside of this, of course, being that they'd lose a lot of the mysticism that makes them so unique. Though that does beg a question. Is it better to maintain the mysticism and uniqueness that made you so idolized by society if it meant that you might be considered a threat or a monster? Or do you abandon it and slip into the crowd of obscurity and hold on to your life? That's the question a historical vampire would have to ask if it were to survive into the modern world and continue to feed. Thank y'all for watching this episode of Fantastical History. Take care, and I'll see you in my next video.